The attorney's office was on the second floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and radiator heat, and Clara Voss sat in one of the waiting room chairs with her coat still on because the coat was the warmest thing she owned and she had learned over the past 14 months not to take it off in rooms she might need to leave quickly. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Nora was in the chair beside her, 7 years old, wearing the purple fleece Clara had found at the Salvation Army bin on Route 17 the previous October. Nora had her knees pulled to her chest and her chin resting on them, and she was reading a paperback that Clara had checked out of the Harwick Public Library 3 days ago. She read the way some children eat, steadily without looking up, as if the world around her was a minor interruption. The receptionist had told them it would be 15 minutes. It had been 30. Clara did not check her phone because her phone had 12% battery and the charger was in the car, and the car was parked on the street 2 blocks away where the meter ran out at noon. She watched the second hand on the wall clock instead. The second wife was already inside. Clara had seen her go in. Miriam Voss, 58, wearing a camel hair coat with a real belt, carrying a leather handbag that Clara recognized as the kind that came in a dust bag when you bought it. Clara had worked in retail long enough, in a life that now felt like someone else's, to know the difference between the bag and the imitation. Miriam was carrying the bag. Clara had nothing to carry. The papers Calvert Ames had mailed her were folded in her coat pocket, creased at the center from being read and reread in the front seat of her 2009 Civic over the past 3 days. She had read them enough times that she could have recited them, but she kept taking them out anyway because there was something in holding the actual paper that made the words feel more real than they did inside her head. Her father had died on the 14th of February. She had found out from a county clerk's notification form, not from Miriam, not from any family member, because there were no other family members and because Miriam had not called. The form said that as a named party in the estate of Owen Ray Voss, she was required to attend the reading of the will at the offices of Calvert Ames, attorney, on the 28th. It gave no other information. It used the word required. She had folded it and put it in her coat pocket and sat in the car for a long time before she started the engine. She had not seen her father in 4 years. The last time had been a Sunday in early autumn, the kind of day that smells like the end of something, leaves beginning to let go, the air carrying that first cold edge that means the warmth is not coming back. She had driven out to the house on Meridian Road with Nora, who was 3 then, who had fallen asleep in the car seat on the way and woken up confused and clingy when Clara lifted her out. Owen had been on the porch, which is where he always was in weather like that. He was 67 and his hands had already started going, the tremor that would only get worse, and he was holding a coffee cup in both palms the way you hold something when you can't trust one hand to do the work alone. He had looked at her the way he looked at things he wasn't sure he was allowed to want. They had sat on the porch for 2 hours. Nora had eventually woken up enough to be charmed by the yard, which had a crabapple tree and a border collie named Rusk who let children climb on him without complaint. Clara and her father had talked the way people talk when there is something large they are both carefully walking around. He had asked about her job at the medical billing company. She had told him it was fine. He had asked about her apartment in Dorrance. She had said it was small but manageable. He had not asked about Nora's father and she had not offered. Before she left he had pressed 2 folded 20s into her hand, and she had almost refused and then had not refused because Nora needed winter boots and the 20s would cover them. That was the last time. 6 weeks later she lost the job. The medical billing company was acquired. The regional office was closed, and Clara was given 2 weeks severance and a form letter that said the company valued her contributions. She had been there 4 years. Her contributions had been 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, with 1 sick day taken when Nora had an ear infection and she could not find anyone to watch her. She did not feel valued. The apartment in Dorrance lasted 3 months after the job. She found other work, retail first, then part-time data entry, then nothing for 2 months while the savings ran down and the landlord's patience ran with it. She moved twice into cheaper places and then into a room in a house that had 4 other rooms with 4 other people and 1 bathroom with a lock that didn't catch, and then out of that too in January, in the middle of the kind of cold that makes the air feel hostile. She and Nora had been in the car since January. She had a storage unit on Birch Street where the rest of their things lived. She had a library card, which was how Nora had books, And she had a gym membership at the YMCA on Foster, which was how they had showers. She had a parking spot behind the Food Lion on South Main where she could run the engine for warmth without being moved along, because the manager there, a round man named Gerald who had a son Nora's age, looked the other way. She had not told her father any of this. She had thought about calling. She had composed the call in her head many times, sitting in the car in the Food Lion lot while Nora slept in the back seat, the engine running for heat and the radio off because Nora slept better without it. She would run through the opening line in her head. Dad, I need to tell you something. Or Dad, things have been hard. Or just his name Owen, because she had never called him Dad the way other people called their fathers Dad, easily without weight. She had always said it was something behind it, some consciousness of the word and what it contained, and maybe that was why it was hard to start. She never made the call. She told herself it was because she didn't know how to say the words out loud, but the truth was simpler and harder. She was afraid that if she called and asked for help, he would help her. And if he helped her, it would mean she had needed him to. And needing him meant admitting that the distance between them had cost her something she hadn't been willing to measure. The distance had not been dramatic. That was the thing about it. There had been no single rupture, no fight that drew a line. It had been incremental, the accumulation of small things. Her not calling as often. Him not pushing when she didn't. Miriam's even pleasantness creating a surface that was technically warm and actually impenetrable. Owen adjusting, accommodating, pulling back by degrees until the degrees added up to years. She had told herself she was giving him space to have the life he'd chosen. She had told herself she was being mature about it, about the remarriage, about the new arrangements. She had told herself a lot of things in her 20s that she looked at differently now. From the front seat of a 2009 Civic with her daughter sleeping in the back, and her whole address being a parking lot. She had not called. And then February 14th, a form letter from a county clerk. The door to Calvert Ames's office opened and a woman Clara didn't recognize leaned out and said her name. Clara stood, adjusted her coat, looked at Nora. "Stay here and read," she said. "I'll be fast." Nora looked up from the book. "Is this the part where they tell you about Grandpa's stuff?" "Yes. Is there a lot of stuff?" "I don't know, honey." Nora went back to her book. The receptionist gave Nora a look that was trying to be kind and landing closer to pitying, and Clara walked past her into the office before she had to see what her own face did in response to that look. Calvert Ames was a small man in his late 60s with a white mustache and reading glasses on a chain that he hadn't put on yet. He had the organized stillness of someone who has delivered difficult news many times and has learned that the delivery goes better when his own face stays neutral. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Miriam was already in the other chair. She acknowledged Clara the way you acknowledge someone in an elevator, briefly, with a nod that communicated neither warmth nor hostility, only the basic social minimum. Her camel coat was folded over her lap. Her bag was on the floor beside her right foot. Clara had met Miriam 4 times. Owen had married her 3 years after Clara's mother died. When Clara was 22 and living in the apartment in Dorrance and working at the retail job she had then, which was a different retail job from the ones that came later. The wedding had been small and civil. Clara had worn a blue dress and smiled in the photograph and driven home afterward and cried in a way she hadn't planned on. Not from grief about the marriage specifically. More from the particular loneliness of watching a parent build a new life that fits together completely without you in it. Miriam was not cruel. That was the thing Clara had decided over the years, the thing she kept returning to when she examined her feelings about her father's second marriage. Miriam was not a cruel person. She was a contained person, a person who organized her generosity carefully, who gave to the things she had decided deserved giving and withdrew from the things she had decided did not. Clara had been, from the beginning, in the second category. Not actively excluded, just not included. She had watched her father adjust to that over time. The way he stopped mentioning Clara in conversations Miriam was part of. The way the visits became shorter and less frequent, and then eventually that last Sunday on the porch. She was not here to be angry about any of it. She was here because a form letter had said required. Calvert Ames put on his reading glasses and opened the folder on his desk. "The estate of Owen Ray Voss," he said. He said it the way people say the names of the dead, with a small pause before them, a gap that acknowledges the weight of the tense change. Now was He read through the preliminary language, the boilerplate, the legal sentences that established what the document was and what it intended. Clara folded her hands on her knee and listened. The house on Meridian Road, its contents, and the associated property, including the vehicle, to Miriam and Voss' surviving spouse. Miriam's posture didn't change. She had known. Of course she had known. The savings account at First National, the balance of which at time of death was $11,412, to Miriam and Voss. Still nothing from Miriam. Clara watched her profile and thought about how you get to a place in life where $11,000 doesn't move your face. She had been in a car for 14 months. $11,000 was the difference between having a life and not having one, and she was sitting 2 feet from a woman whose expression did not flicker. The property at 4 Rural Route 9, Calvert Ames said, consisting of the original Voss gristmill structure and the half-acre parcel on which it stands, to Clara Elaine Voss, my daughter. Clara looked up from her hands. Calvert Ames continued reading. No other bequests. The estate was small. Some personal effects that Miriam was authorized to distribute as she saw fit. Standard language about debts and taxes. He finished, removed his reading glasses and set them on the desk. Well, Miriam said. Her voice was pleasant, the voice she used in social situations where pleasantness was the correct tool. You get the mill then? Clara looked at her. I didn't know he still owned it, Clara said. She meant it. She had not thought about the mill in years. He never sold it, Miriam said. She touched the handle of her bag with 2 fingers. It was his grandfather's. He couldn't bring himself to. She paused. There's nothing in it. He hadn't been out there in years, not since his hands got bad. She folded the strap neatly over the top of the bag. It's $3 of property value if the county even wants it. She said it without malice. She said it the way she said most things, with the even tone of a person conveying information they consider factual. The mill was worthless. She was not being cruel. She was being accurate in the way she understood accuracy. Calvert Ames was looking at his folder. He slid an envelope across the desk toward Clara. Your father asked me to give you this at the reading. He said it was personal. Clara picked up the envelope. Her name was on the front in handwriting she recognized from birthday cards, from the backs of photographs, from a note he had tucked inside the Christmas card when she was 11 that said, I am proud of you. Just for the record. The handwriting was different now, uneven, the letters larger and less controlled, but it was still his. She put the envelope in her coat pocket. Miriam stood, arranged her coat over her arm, and picked up her bag. She looked at Clara with the same even pleasantness. I hope it's useful to you, she said. The mill. I genuinely do. She meant that too, Clara thought. She genuinely did. Clara drove the 2 miles to Route 9 with Nora in the back seat, and the envelope still in her coat pocket. She had not opened it in the attorney's office. She had not wanted to open it in front of Miriam or Calvert Ames or the pitying receptionist. Whatever was in it was between her and her father, and that was a category that had been private for long enough that she intended to keep it that way. She had almost not come today at all. That was the thing she hadn't told anyone, partly because there was no one to tell and partly because it embarrassed her in a way she couldn't cleanly articulate. She had received the form letter and she had sat with it for 2 days, turning it over in her hands in the way you turn over something you're not sure you want to open. She had argued herself through it in the Food Lion parking lot on 2 separate nights. He's gone. There's nothing left. There is nothing in that office for you. Go. Don't go. What does it change either way? What had finally decided her was Nora. Not something Nora said exactly. More what she was doing the night Clara was working through it. Sitting in the back seat with her library book and a gas station granola bar. Reading by the light of her small clip-on lamp that attached to the cover, perfectly content, making the best of things the way she always did, the way she had been making the best of things since January without a single complaint that Clara could name. Clara had looked at her daughter in the rearview mirror and thought, you deserve more than I have been able to give you. And if there is anything in that office that changes the shape of things even slightly, you deserve for me to go and find out. So she had come. She had put on her good coat, the one without the fraying at the left cuff, and she had driven to Calvert Ames's building and sat in the plastic chair and listened to a man read her father's name in the past tense, and she had been given an envelope with her name on it in her father's handwriting, and then she had walked back out to the waiting room and gotten her daughter and they had gotten in the car. She had not opened the envelope yet. She was saving it for the mill, she realized, without having decided to. The way you save certain things for the right place. The day was gray. March in this part of the state was the color of wet concrete, the sky and the ground trading the same shade back and forth, the trees still bare, the grass still winter pale. She drove through the county roads with the heat on low to save gas, and Nora read in the back seat without talking. The night before, she had parked at the Food Lion lot as usual, and they had eaten crackers and peanut butter, and apple slices in the front seat with the engine running and the radio on low. Nora had fallen asleep early, which she always did when things were uncertain, her body finding sleep the way it found stillness, instinctively, as a way of removing itself from the weight of the day. Clara had sat awake in the driver's seat for a long time after, watching the lot empty out, watching the last Food Lion employees leave in their cars one by one until the lot was quiet. She had taken the form letter out of her pocket and read it again. Named party in the estate of Owen Ray Voss. Required. She had looked at those words in the dark for a long time. Required. She had been a named party in her father's life for 31 years, and the word that finally got her into a room with him, even now when he was gone, was required. She had thought about the last Sunday on the porch, the two folded 20s, his hands around the coffee cup. She had thought about the years between that Sunday and this parking lot, all the days that had accumulated while she was closing drawers and he was closing his, both of them thorough in their own way, both of them building a silence that had its own architecture. She had thought about Miriam, about the camel coat and the leather bag and the pleasant voice that kept its warmth like a budget, doled out to what earned it. She had thought about what the word required said about how her father had arranged his affairs, that he had needed a legal mechanism to ensure she would come because he couldn't be certain anymore that she would come on her own. That had sat in her chest for a while, that specific kind of sadness. She had fallen asleep eventually, tilted against the headrest, and dreamed something she couldn't remember in the morning. She had been out to the mill once when she was maybe 9 or 10. She remembered it as enormous, which meant it probably wasn't, because everything is enormous when you are 9. Her father had taken her on a Saturday morning in early summer. She remembered the sound of the stream, which ran alongside the building and once powered the wheel, before the wheel stopped being used. She remembered the smell inside, the particular dry dusty smell of ground grain baked into old wood over 100 years of milling, the kind of smell that doesn't go away even when the work does. She remembered her father putting his hand flat on the main grinding stone and saying his grandfather had stood in this same spot and done the same thing, and that there was something in that he couldn't fully explain but that she would understand when she was older. She was 31 now. She was not sure she understood it yet. But she was going. Route 9 became a county road that became a single-lane track running alongside a stand of white pine, and at the end of the track was the mill. She pulled the Civic up to the front and turned off the engine, and they both looked at it through the windshield. It was a timber frame building, 2 stories, dark wood that had gone almost black with weather and time. The water wheel was on the left side, dry now, the paddles gray and warped but still attached. A stone foundation that went into the ground a foot or more, solid, not crumbling, whatever else time had done to this place. A rusted metal sign above the door that she couldn't read from here. Windows on the second floor, intact. Windows on the ground floor, one of them cracked at the lower corner but not broken through. It did not look like $3 of property value. It looked old. It looked heavy. It looked like a thing that had been built to last and had done exactly that. "Can we go in?" Nora said. "Yes," Clara said. "That's ours." She said it without planning to. She heard it come out of her mouth and felt the strangeness of it. Ours. She had not owned anything in 14 months. She had not owned anything that mattered in longer than that. The door was locked with a padlock, which surprised her until she looked at the key ring in the envelope of personal effects that Calvert Ames had handed her along with a small collection of things her father had specified for her. The envelope, the key ring, and a folded square of paper that was a hand-drawn map of the interior she couldn't make sense of yet. The key ring had 2 keys. One for the padlock, which she identified by trying both. The padlock opened with the first one, its mechanism stiff but functional, the kind of lock that's been closed for a long time but maintained. She pressed against the door with her shoulder and it gave, dragging across the stone threshold with a sound like something waking. The smell came first. She had remembered it correctly. Grain and old wood and something underneath both of those. Something like dry stone and cold air. The smell of a building that has been sealed against weather for years and kept its own internal atmosphere. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of the inside of something, the smell of enclosure and preservation. She stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed it in, not because it was pleasant exactly but because it was familiar in a way she hadn't expected, and familiarity, when you have been without a fixed address for 14 months, has its own particular weight. The main floor was one large room. The grinding mechanism dominated the center. The main millstone, horizontal, 4 feet across, set in its housing with the drive shaft ascending through the floor and ceiling. Around it, the working structure of the mill, wooden bins and chutes and levers, all of it dusty and still. Cobwebs where the light came in from the cracked window, thick and old, undisturbed. Wooden shelving along one wall empty. A workbench near the back wall with tools still on it, laid out in some order that someone had established decades ago, and no one had disturbed since. The tools were not rusted. She noticed that. The chisels and levels in plain iron. The wooden mallet with a handle worn smooth from generations of hands. Someone had oiled them or treated them, or simply kept the space dry enough that they hadn't deteriorated. Her father, she thought. Coming out here on his better days, maintaining things against the possibility that they would matter to someone eventually. Nora walked in after her and stopped just inside the door, looking up. "Whoa," she said. Clara looked up too. The ceiling was high, the rafters visible. The structure of the building laid bare. Mortise and tin and joinery, wooden pegs, no nails in the original frame. Her grandfather had built this with other men. She knew that. Men from the county who came to raise a barn or a mill the way men did then. A community effort, everyone working. There was something in the joinery that you could feel even looking at it. The care. The intention of something meant to stand. She walked slowly around the room. Past the empty shelves, running one finger along the wood. Past the workbench, looking at the tools without touching them. Past a wooden ladder fixed to the wall that led up to the second floor. She paused at the bottom of it, looking up. The second floor was storage. She could see that. Old wooden crates and what looked like bundled rope and a metal object she couldn't identify from below. She would go up later. She came to the main grinding stone and put her hand flat on it. It was cold. Cold from the March air and from being stone and from being still. A surface that hadn't moved in decades. But it was solid in the way that large old things are solid, with a different density than ordinary objects. She thought about the weight of grain that had been fed through this stone, the 1,000 bushels her great-grandfather had milled over 30 years of work, the specific physical labor of that, the flour and the chaff and the dust that had lived in this room for a generation. Her father had stood here, his hand in this same position on this same stone. And his grandfather before him. 3 generations of the same gesture, pressing palm to granite, the way you press your hand to something and acknowledge that it is real and solid and has been here longer than you have. She kept her hand there for a moment. Then she took the envelope from her coat pocket and opened it. The letter was 4 pages, written on both sides of 2 sheets of plain white paper in her father's large uneven handwriting. She recognized the compensation, the way the letters were formed carefully, slowly, the way you write when your hand doesn't cooperate and you're making it behave through will alone. It must have taken him a long time. She stood in the mill with the grinding stone at her back and she read. He began with her name. Clara. Just that, not dear Clara, not a preamble. Just her name, the way he said it when something mattered, cutting the softening off the front. I don't know how much time has passed since I wrote this. I don't know what the world looks like for you right now. I imagine you have done things I don't know about and been places I haven't heard of and had trouble I couldn't help with. And I imagine the trouble part is more true than you'd want me to know. You were always that way. You got it from me. We are both people who put our hard things in a drawer and close it. She had to stop for a moment after that sentence. She kept reading. The mill belonged to my grandfather, as you know. He built it in 1911 with timber from this property and stone he pulled from the creek bed and from the quarry 8 miles east. He ran it for 30 years. My father used it for another 15 after him. Then the county put the grain elevator in on Route 5 and the mill stopped making commercial sense. But we kept it. My father kept it because it was his father's. I kept it because it was mine to keep. I want to tell you something about this building that I never told you when I had the chance to say it out loud. And that is my fault, and I am not going to spend this letter making excuses for it. She read the next paragraph twice. In 1987, when I was having the worst year of my adult life, and I won't go into that because you were 8 and it isn't yours to carry, I came out to this mill and I spent 4 days cleaning it out, going through everything my father had left when he stopped using it. I found things. I am going to tell you what I found, and I am going to tell you where they are. And I am going to ask you to find someone who understands what they are worth. I didn't sell them. I couldn't. But I kept them and I documented them and I protected them, and they have been here ever since. Clara looked up from the letter at the grinding stone in front of her. She looked at the mill around her, the dusty shelves, the old tools, the high rafters. She looked back at the letter. Behind the main grinding stone on the wall side, there is a section of the stone foundation that looks like all the rest but is not. My grandfather built a dry space into the foundation when he built the mill. A practical man's solution to the problem of keeping important things safe from the damp and the flood. The foundation wall there is double thick, and the outer face swings out on an iron pin set in the mortar. You will need the second key on the ring. The lock is low near the floor on the left side of the seam. You will have to look closely because it is set into the stone and does not stand out. What is inside has been there since 1987. I had it looked at twice. The first time was in 1989 by a man named Frederick Hartwell in Columbus who dealt in antiques and estate pieces. The second time was in 2019 by a woman named Jean Pryor, who worked for an auction house in Philadelphia. Both of them told me the same thing with a 30-year gap between them, and the second number was considerably larger than the first. There is a folder in the space with their reports. There is also a notebook I kept of every person I spoke to and everything I was told. I want you to have all of it before you talk to anyone. Clara, I am giving you this mill because I cannot think of a better thing to give you. I know what Miriam thinks of it. She thinks it is nothing. She is not wrong that it is not beautiful. It isn't. But there is something in there that I found by accident and held on to by choice, and it belongs to someone in this family, and the someone in this family who should have it is you. There are 2 more things I need to say and then I will stop. The first is that I am sorry for the distance. I am not going to explain it because explanations are what cowards give instead of apologies, and I want to give you an apology, just the apology without anything attached to it that lets me off. The second is that I don't know what your life looks like right now. I said that at the beginning and I mean it. But I want you to know that whatever it looks like, you are capable of more steadiness than you believe you are. You always were. You put your hard things in a drawer and that has cost you, I know. But the same quality that made you close the drawer is the quality that will let you open it when it matters. You are going to be all right, Clara. I believe that the way I believe the stone floor of this mill is solid. Not because I can see the whole foundation. Because I have stood on it. I am glad you came to the mill. That's the first thing. Your father, she read it standing in her coat, with Nora quiet somewhere behind her. When she finished, she folded it along the original creases and put it back in the envelope and the envelope back in her pocket. She stood there for a minute. Outside, the creak she could hear through the walls moved with the particular sound of early spring, water running over stone, cold and purposeful. One of the windows let in enough light that the dust in the air was visible, small particles moving in currents she couldn't otherwise detect. The mill was breathing. Old buildings do that. Exchanging air through the gaps in their structure, slow and continuous, the way large things breathe. Her father had stood here. He had pressed his hand to this stone and told her there was something in it she would understand when she was older. She was older now. She was also standing in the only thing she owned in the world, in a coat she hadn't taken off indoors since January, with a key ring in her hand and a letter that said the foundation wall behind the main grinding stone was not what it appeared to be. She looked at Nora. Nora was sitting on the floor near the workbench with her book open in her lap, reading in the available light from the window the way children read in any available light, without complaining about the conditions. Stay there for a minute, Clara said. I need to look at something. Okay, Nora said, not looking up. Clara went around the back of the grinding stone to the wall side. The space was narrow, 2 feet between the stone housing and the foundation wall, and she had to turn sideways to move through it. The light didn't reach well back here. She took her phone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight. The foundation wall was river stone and mortar, dark and old, slightly damp to the touch from the cold seeping through from outside. It looked, as her father had said, like all the rest of it. She ran her light along the stone slowly, looking for the seam. She almost missed it. It was not dramatic, the line where the swinging section met the fixed wall. It was a gap no wider than a knife blade, running vertically from near the floor to about 4 feet up, then horizontally across. She wouldn't have seen it if she hadn't been looking for exactly this shape. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story. She crouched and moved her light near the floor on the left side. The lock was there. Small, set into a carved notch in the mortar, flush with the surface. Brass, not iron, old but not corroded, which told her that someone, her father she thought, had maintained it, had come out here and oiled it, had kept it ready. She fit the second key into the lock. It turned. She felt something release in the wall, a catch giving way. And when she pressed her hand flat against the stone face, it moved. Not swinging freely, but giving, pivoting on the iron pin her father had described. She pressed harder and it opened, a section of foundation wall 18 inches wide, 3 feet tall, swinging out toward her on a hinge buried in the mortar. The space behind was dark and dry and the size of a large closet. She held her phone light up. On the floor of the space, arranged with a care that told her someone had thought about this arrangement, were objects wrapped in canvas. Not piled, not thrown in. Set. Each one placed with deliberate attention, some upright, some horizontal, each with a canvas covering that had been tied with twine. She counted them without touching anything. 7 pieces. 8 if you counted the flat rectangular shape leaning against the back wall that was wrapped differently, in what looked like oilcloth rather than canvas. Beside the objects, on a wooden shelf built into the side of the space at about waist height, were 2 things side by side. A manila folder, thick, held closed with a rubber band that had dried and gone stiff. And a notebook, the kind with a black cover and lined pages, the kind you find in any stationery store in any decade, worn at the spine from being opened and closed many times. Clara reached for the notebook first. She opened it. The first page was in her father's handwriting, younger and more controlled than the letter, the hand from 30-some years ago before the tremor came. It said at the top, "What I found in the Voss mill, 1987. Documentation, valuations, contacts. For Clara if she ever needs it. For Clara if she ever needs it." She stood in the space behind the grinding stone of her grandfather's mill, in a coat she had not taken off indoors in 14 months, in the only thing in the world that was hers, and she read those 7 words 3 times. She could hear Nora in the main room, the soft sound of a page turning. She could hear the creek outside moving over stone, cold and clear and going where it was going. She held the notebook and she did not cry, not quite, though she stood for a long moment at the border of it, feeling the weight of everything on one side and the small warmth of those words on the other. For Clara if she ever needs it. She needed it. She was here. She reached for the manila folder next and pulled the rubber band off carefully, afraid it would snap and take some of the paper with it, but it held. She opened the folder. The first document inside was a typed letter on letterhead from a firm called Hartwell Antiques and Estate Services in Columbus, Ohio, dated April of 1989. It was addressed to her father at the Meridian Roadhouse. She scanned it quickly, catching phrases, standing in the dim space with her phone light in one hand and the folder in the other. Dear Mr. Voss, regarding the items examined at your property on March 14th and 15th of this year, it is my professional opinion, after thorough examination and research into comparative auction results and available documentation. She turned the page. The letter was 3 pages. She would read it fully later in the light. But she read the summary paragraph at the bottom of the 3rd page, the one set off from the rest, the one "Her I went to the way your eye goes to" the number at the bottom of a bill. She read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. She stood in the hidden space behind the grinding stone of the Voss mill and she looked at the number on the page, the conservative number, the 1989 number, the number from 35 years ago before any market had moved in any direction for 35 years, and she thought about Miriam in the attorney's office with her camel coat and her leather bag and her pleasant voice saying it's $3 of property value if the county even wants it. She thought about 35 years of market movement, about what happens to numbers when they sit still in a folder, while the world's appetite for certain things grows. About the 2019 valuation her father had mentioned in the letter, the one he said was considerably larger than the first. She thought about the 7 canvas-wrapped objects on the floor of this dry space. She thought about the oilcloth package leaning against the back wall. She thought about her father driving out here on whatever days he could still drive, before his hands got too bad, coming out to this mill that looked like nothing from the road, on a property that Miriam called $3 of value, maintaining things in the dark behind a stone wall for a daughter he hadn't seen in 4 years, keeping everything ready, keeping everything dry. He couldn't bring himself to sell it. That sentence from the letter. He had written it about the mill itself, about why he'd kept the property when it no longer made commercial sense. But standing here, Clara thought it applied to all of it. The objects under the canvas, the folder with the valuations, the notebook with 30 years of documentation. He hadn't been able to bring himself to sell any of it, because selling it would have meant closing a door, and this door had been left specifically, carefully, deliberately open, for Clara if she ever needs it. She put the folder and the notebook under her arm. She turned and pushed the stone panel back into place and felt it catch. She came out from behind the grinding stone into the main room. Nora looked up from her book. "Mom, your face is doing something." Clara looked at her daughter sitting on the floor of a mill that had been built in 1911 by her great-great-grandfather, surrounded by the smell of grain and stone and old wood, with a paperback balanced on her knees. The clip-on lamp from the night before was still clipped to the spine of the book, casting its small circle of light. Nora had thought to bring it. She always thought of the practical thing without being asked. "Good something or bad something?" Nora said. Clara sat down on the floor beside her. "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly. "I need to read some things." "Okay," Nora said and went back to her book. Clara opened the notebook to the first page. Her father's handwriting, younger, controlled, the hand of a man in his early 30s who had come to his grandfather's mill in the worst year of his adult life and found something he hadn't been looking for. He had written every name, every contact, everything he was told, every number and date and description, in this notebook over 3 decades. He had maintained the space behind the grinding stone. He had had it looked at twice. He had kept the folder dry and the lock oiled and the canvas covers on the objects so the dust and the damp wouldn't touch them. He had not sold any of it. He had kept all of it. He had left it here, in the dark behind a stone wall, for the person in the family who should have it. The second page of the notebook listed what he had found in 1987. He had written each item with the methodical care of someone who understood that documentation was a form of protection, that a thing unnamed could be disputed but a thing recorded in a dated hand had a different kind of standing in the world. He had numbered them, 1 through 7, with a short description of each and the condition he had found it in. Beside each number he had written a question mark, which she understood to mean he hadn't known yet what he was holding. Not precisely. Not enough to feel certain. The third page was a record of his first call to Frederick Hartwell in Columbus. The date, the duration, the gist of what Hartwell had said before he came in person. She read it and then read the page after that, which was his record of Hartwell's visit, what he had examined, what he had said while examining it, the specific phrases he had used and the ones he had avoided, the careful vocabulary of a man who was building toward a number he didn't want to say too soon. She turned pages. She read her father's handwriting moving through years. 1989, 1994, 2001, a call he had made to a museum in Cincinnati that had referred him to someone else, who had confirmed what Hartwell had said. 2009, another contact, this one unsolicited. A letter that had arrived from a collector in New England who had somehow heard about the mill and the things in it and was asking, politely but clearly, whether Owen Voss had any interest in discussing terms. Her father had written next to that entry told him no. Not yet. Not yet. She had to stop for a moment at that. The patience in it. The long game of a man who had found something valuable, and had neither panicked into selling nor been seduced by the first offer. Who had said not yet and meant it and held the line for 30 more years while the world's appetite for what he had moved and grew and moved again. The 2019 entry was near the back of the notebook. Jean Pryor's name, the Philadelphia auction house. A visit date in October. Her father's notes of the visit were detailed, more detailed than the earlier entries, written with the urgency of a man who knows he may not have infinite time and wants to get the information down correctly. He had written what she said about each item. He had written the updated values. She read those numbers. She sat on the floor of her grandfather's mill with the notebook open in her lap and she read the updated numbers and she felt something move through her that was not excitement. Not yet, because she was still too raw from the last 14 months to let excitement arrive unchecked. What she felt was more like the sensation of ground appearing under your feet when you didn't know you were falling. Solid. Unexpected. Real. She looked up from the notebook. The light through the cracked window had moved as the morning advanced, finding the dust in the air and the stone floor and the top of Nora's head, and the creek outside kept moving with its cold insistent sound, and the mill around them held still the way it had been holding still for 100 years, patient, solid, full of things that were waiting for someone to come and understand what they were. Nora had fallen asleep against the base of the workbench at some point, her book closed and laid carefully beside her, her hands folded in her lap the way she slept, tidy, self-contained. Clara sat in the available light with the notebook and the folder and the key ring and 2 keys, one of which opened the lock on the outer door and one of which opened a door that no one had known existed except her father, and she looked at her sleeping daughter and then at the mill around them and then at the numbers on the page in her lap. Her father had said, "You are going to be all right, Clara. I believe that the way I believe the stone floor of this mill is solid. Not because I can see the whole foundation, because I have stood on it." She pressed her hand flat on the stone floor beside her. It was solid. Cold and old and solid. She had a lot of phone calls to make and people she had never spoken to whose names were in this notebook and things she did not fully understand yet that needed understanding. She had a property that Miriam had assessed as worthless and a hidden room behind a grinding stone that suggested, quietly and in her father's careful hand, that Miriam had been wrong about that in a way that was going to take some time to fully appreciate. She was not all right yet. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. She was in a coat she hadn't taken off indoors since January, and she had 12% battery on her phone, and a parking meter 2 miles away that had run out an hour ago. But she was here. She had come to the mill. That was the first thing. Her father had said so. She woke Nora gently, the way she always did, with a hand on her shoulder and her name said quietly twice before the third time with any pressure behind it. Nora came up from sleep the way she did most things, without complaint, blinking in the mill light and looking around the room with the calm assessment of a child who had learned that waking up in unexpected places was a category of experience rather than a crisis. "We have to go," Clara said. "Meet her." Nora picked up her book. She picked up her clip-on lamp and unclipped it from the spine and put it in her jacket pocket. She stood and looked around the mill once more, taking in the grinding stone and the high rafters and the dusty light. "Can we come back?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. "This is ours. We can come back whenever we want." She said it the same way she had said it that morning, without planning, and it landed the same way, with that small strangeness that came from the word ours having been out of her vocabulary for so long. They walked out into the gray afternoon and she locked the padlock and they got in the car and drove back toward town with the notebook and the folder on the passenger seat and the numbers from Jean Pryor's 2019 valuation running quietly in her head. She did not tell Nora the numbers. Not yet. She was not entirely certain herself what they meant in practical terms, what the distance was between a number on a page in a folder inside a stone wall and a number in a bank account. She had seen enough of the last several years to know that the distance could be considerable, and that the path between them was not always straight. What she knew was this. There were 7 objects in that room and they had been appraised twice in 30 years by 2 different people, and both of them had arrived at numbers that did not say worthless. The second number had been considerably larger than the first, as her father had written, and the second appraisal had been done 5 years ago, not 35. She needed to understand what the 7 objects were. She had her father's descriptions from the notebook, written in 1987 before he knew what he was looking at, and she had the names Hartwell and Pryor and the summary figures from the Hartwell letter she had found in the folder. But she had not yet unwrapped a single canvas cover. She had not looked at any of the objects directly. She drove past the Food Lion and kept going. Past the YMCA and the storage unit on Birch Street and the library. She drove to the county courthouse and parked in the visitor's lot. "Stay here," she said to Nora. "I'll be 10 minutes. Inside the courthouse on the second floor, the county assessor's office kept property records. She asked the clerk, a young woman with a ponytail who looked at Clara's coat without commenting on it, for the current assessment file on the parcel at 4, Rural Route 9. The clerk printed it. Clara read it standing at the counter. The assessed value was listed at $4,200. The parcel, half an acre, one structure, classified as agricultural, last reviewed in 2011. The structure had been listed as a storage building in poor condition. No utility connections noted. No improvements in the recorded period. $4,200. Miriam had said $3 with the ease of someone throwing away a receipt. The county had said $4,200 with the indifference of a bureaucracy that had not looked closely in 13 years. Neither of them had gone inside. Clara folded the assessment printout and put it with the notebook in the folder. She went back to the car. Nora was reading. The meter had 3 minutes left. She drove to the library. Nora went to the children's section the way she always did, without needing direction, and Clara sat at one of the public computers in the back row and opened a browser. She searched for Frederick Hartwell, Hartwell Antiques and Estate Services, Columbus, Ohio. The business was not listed. She tried the name alone. An obituary in a Columbus paper, dated 2014. Frederick Hartwell, 73, retired. Antiques dealer. Survived by his wife and 2 sons. The obituary mentioned his specialization in American folk art and decorative objects. She noted that. American folk art and decorative objects. She searched for Jean Pryor, Philadelphia Auction House. Found a profile at a firm called Pryor and Kellner Auction Associates on Walnut Street in Philadelphia. Jean Pryor, partner and specialist in American decorative arts, folk art, and outsider art. The profile had a photograph. A woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair, and the composed expression of someone accustomed to assessing value. The firm's website listed recent sales. Clara looked at the recent sales section. She spent 40 minutes on the computer. She looked at comparable auction results for American folk art pieces sold in the past 5 years. She looked at what the market had done. She read 2 articles from trade publications that the library's database carried. One about the sustained growth in American folk art collecting over the past decade and one about what drove the premium end of that market, which turned out to be condition, provenance, and rarity, all 3, the way a stool needs 3 legs. She thought about the objects in the hidden room, wrapped in canvas since 1987, in a dry space behind a stone wall that her father had maintained, in a mill that nobody had gone into for years. She thought about the word undisturbed. She thought about rarity. She wrote Jean Pryor's office number in the notebook on the page after her father's last entry, and she closed the notebook and went to find Nora. They ate dinner in the car that night. Crackers and the last of the peanut butter, and 2 bananas Clara had bought from the produce markdown bin at the Food Lion for 60 cents. Nora ate without complaining, which she never did, and told Clara about a book she had found in the library's donation cart. A field guide to North American birds with illustrations by a man named Peterson, which she had checked out because she wanted to know the names of the birds she drew. Clara listened to her daughter explain the difference between a peewee and a phoebe, and she felt the particular tenderness that comes from watching someone pursue a thing they love with complete unself-consciousness, without worrying whether the thing is useful or impressive, just because the thing itself matters to them. She had a field guide and a library card in a parking lot, and a mill that nobody thought was worth anything. In the morning she called Jean Pryor. The phone rang 4 times and went to a professional voicemail that gave the firm's name and hours, and asked her to leave a message. She left her name, her number, the name Owen Voss, and said that she was calling regarding a collection of American folk art objects that Jean Pryor had appraised in 2019, and that she was Owen Voss's daughter, and would appreciate a call back at her convenience. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand. She had 61% battery. She had charged it at the YMCA that morning while she and Nora used the showers. She had $6.40 in her wallet. She had a notebook full of her dead father's handwriting and a key ring with 2 keys, and a mill on Route 9 that contained something worth knowing about. She called Calvert Ames next. His receptionist put her through after a 2-minute hold. Calvert Ames was brief and practical, which she appreciated. She asked whether the property transfer was complete, and whether there was anything she needed to do to establish her ownership formally. He told her the deed had been recorded at the county recorder's office as part of the estate proceedings, and that she was the owner of record. He said he could provide a certified copy of the deed for a $20 fee. She said she would come by at the end of the week when she had the money. He said that was fine and that he wished her well with the property. She thanked him and hung up. She looked at the Food Lion. She needed to think clearly about the order of things. Her father's letter had listed 2 appraisers, Hartwell and Pryor, and Hartwell was dead. Pryor was alive and practicing and had been in this mill 5 years ago, and had written valuations that were sitting in a folder with a dried-out rubber band around it. The notebook had the contact, the visit date, and the summary figures. What she didn't have was the full written report from Pryor, which presumably existed somewhere, either at Pryor's office or in that folder. She had read the summary numbers from her father's notes but not the actual document. She needed to go back to the mill and look at the full folder contents more carefully. She also needed to look at the objects. She drove to Route 9. The mill in the morning was different from the mill in the late afternoon. The light through the cracked window was earlier and lower and hit the stone floor at a different angle, finding things the afternoon light hadn't touched. A worn patch on the boards near the workbench. The shadow the drive shaft cast going straight up through the ceiling. She stood in the doorway for a moment taking it in, then went behind the grinding stone and unlocked the hidden panel. She pulled out the canvas-wrapped objects one at a time and set them on the floor of the main room in the morning light. She counted them again. 7 plus the oilcloth package. She did not rush. She handled each one the way she had watched her father handle things when she was a child, with both hands and without hurrying, respecting the weight of what you were carrying even when you didn't yet know its value. She untied the twine on the first one. Inside the canvas was a carved wooden figure, about 14 inches tall, a man in a wide-brimmed hat with one arm raised. The wood was painted, the paint old, the colors muted and slightly crazed with age the way old paint goes, but intact, not flaking away. The carving was specific and detailed. The hat brim, the fingers on the raised hand, the features of the face. She turned it over. On the base, cut into the wood with a knife, were the initials W. H. and what looked like a date, 1847. She set it down carefully and unwrapped the second one. This was also carved, but different, a roosting bird on a branch, painted black with a red-orange beak, the feathers indicated with careful tool marks rather than paint. The eyes were glass set into the wood. Whoever had made this had been thinking not about speed but about the finished thing, about how it would look in 40 or 100 years when the person who made it was gone and all that remained was the object and what it said about the attention that had gone into it. She sat on the floor and unwrapped all 7. By the time she had the last canvas off, she had a carved human figure, a bird, 2 pieces that appeared to be painted wooden panels, roughly 18 by 24 inches, depicting farm scenes in a flat, direct style that she recognized from something, some image in the back of her memory she couldn't place precisely, a decorated wooden box with iron hinges and a hasp, a carved horse about the size of a shoebox, and a small textile piece, a quilt square or a sampler, framed in a simple wooden frame with embroidered text and figures. She leaned in to read. The text said Voss family, 1851, and below that a list of names in neat thread work. Her family. She looked at the sampler for a long time. The names. She recognized some of them from what her father had said about the mill over the years, from the few times they had talked about where they came from. The names of people who had lived in this county before the county was a county, who had built things meant to last, who had passed those things from hand to hand down a line that ended, for the moment, here with her sitting on a mill floor in a coat she hadn't taken off indoors since January. She took the folder from the panel space and sat in the morning light and went through it properly this time. Not scanning, reading. The folder held 5 documents. The Hartwell letter from 1989, which she had already read in part. A 2-page follow-up from Hartwell in 1991 responding to a question her father had written him. the question about how to properly store the objects to prevent deterioration. Hartwell's answer was detailed and specific. Low humidity, stable temperature, no light exposure, the canvas covers her father had already used were appropriate. A dehumidifier if the space was prone to moisture. He had also noted in the last paragraph of that letter that the market for American folk art was in the early stages of what he believed would be a sustained period of collector interest and that Owen Voss was wise to hold. The third document was a photocopy of an article from a trade publication called the Antiques Quarterly, dated 1997, about the Voss family of the county and their connection to a regional tradition of wood carving and decorative arts in the mid-19th century. The article mentioned in its third paragraph that a number of objects attributed to the Voss family workshop had disappeared from the historical record after the 1940s, and that their current whereabouts were unknown. There was a footnote at the bottom of the page in her father's handwriting. He had written, "I found them." She laughed. She hadn't expected to, and it came out short and surprised. A single note that bounced off the stone walls of the mill and went quiet. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She looked at his handwriting, the two words, the understatement of them, the pleasure she could feel in the curve of the letters. A man who had found something remarkable and noted it in the margin of a photocopy as though he were correcting a small factual error in an otherwise accurate report. He had found them. The fourth document was Jean Pryor's full appraisal report from 2019, 12 pages, bound with a binder clip. Clara read it from the first page to the last without stopping. Jean Pryor had appraised all 7 objects and the oilcloth package. The oilcloth package, she discovered on the third page of the report, contained 2 paintings, oil on canvas, each roughly 16 by 20 inches, attributed to a named regional artist who had worked in this county in the 1860s. She did not recognize the name, but Pryor's language around them was precise and serious. Significant examples, unusual condition given age, provenance directly traceable to the Voss family. She read the individual valuations. Each one had a range, conservative to projected high, based on current comparable sales data and collector demand. The carved figure with the initials W.H. had a range. The bird had a range. The painted panels, the decorated box, the horse, the sampler each had a range. The 2 paintings in the oilcloth package had ranges that were larger than the others, substantially larger at the high end, because they were attributed works by a named hand and because comparable pieces by the same artist had sold at auction in the previous 2 years at prices that Pryor listed, with the auction house names and dates in the footnote. The summary page was the last page. Clara read it. She sat with the folder in her lap and the morning light on the floor around her, and she read the summary page numbers the way she had been reading everything in this mill, carefully, without rushing, giving each word and figure the attention her father had given to every part of this when he assembled it. The conservative total, all 9 objects, low end of each range, was not a fortune. She was clear-eyed about that. She had looked at enough comparable sales in the library the day before to understand what it was. It was not the kind of number that erases a history of difficulty or makes every previous problem disappear. But it was the kind of number that changes the shape of the next several years. It was the kind of number that means the decisions you make in the coming months are made from a different position than the one you had been making them from. It was the kind of number that means your daughter gets a roof. The projected high, all 9 objects if the market held and the right buyers came, was considerably more than the conservative total. Pryor had noted this in her conclusion paragraph. She had written that the collection was unusual in that it represented a coherent body of work from a single regional tradition, that such coherence added a premium above the sum of individual parts, and that a specialist auction or a targeted private sale to a museum or significant collector could achieve outcomes toward the upper range of her projections. Coherent body of work. Her grandfather's mill. Her great-grandfather's mill. Her great-great-grandfather's mill, built in 1911 with stone from this creek and timber from these trees. And inside it, in a dry space behind a hidden door that a practical man had built into the foundation because practical men built storage into things they wanted to last, the work of the people who had come before all of that. The carved figures and the painted panels and the sampler with the family names and the 2 paintings wrapped in oilcloth, preserved by accident and intention and her father's quiet, patient care. She went to the workbench and found a pencil in the tray beside the tools. She opened the notebook to a blank page near the back and she wrote Jean Pryor's number at the top and below it wrote, "Call Tuesday." Below that she wrote, certified deed copy, Ames office $20. Below that she wrote, storage unit check for documents. Below that she wrote, Nora school. She stopped at that last one. She looked at it. Nora had been doing school online, from the library, from the car when she had data, from the YMCA on days they were there long enough. Her teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Huang who communicated primarily through a school app, and had never once asked why Nora's background on video calls was always either a car interior or a library wall, had told Clara at the last parent conference that Nora was performing at grade level in everything and above grade level in reading and science. Mrs. Huang had said this with the careful measured positivity of a teacher who suspected more than she was told, and had chosen to meet the child where she was rather than make the situation more complicated. Clara had wanted to cry at that parent conference. She had not, because Nora was in the next chair and because crying in front of Nora about Nora's circumstances would have required explaining to Nora why those circumstances were something to cry about, and Nora had not arrived at that conclusion on her own and Clara was not going to introduce it. But Nora needed a real school. A classroom with other children and a lunch table and a yard at recess. She needed an address to register with. She needed what every 7-year-old needed, which was a place that was fixed, a place she could expect to return to, a place where the answer to where do you live was not a parking lot with a kind manager who looked the other way. Clara needed to establish residence. She needed to figure out how to get from the numbers in Jean Pryor's appraisal report to something she could spend while also protecting the objects themselves and understanding what it meant to sell them and who the right people were to talk to. She needed to do all of this without making a mistake she couldn't undo, because she had no margin for that kind of mistake. She looked around the mill. She had a structure that was structurally sound. She had looked at the foundation carefully that morning and it was solid. The same stone and mortar that her great-grandfather had set 112 years ago. No shifting, no cracking that she could see. The roof she couldn't fully assess from inside. But the floor was dry, which meant the roof was holding. The windows needed attention. The cracked one and 2 others that had lost their glazing putty. The door was solid on its hinges. She was not going to live in the mill. She was clear about that. She was not romanticizing what she had. But she needed time, and she needed a base from which to make the calls and do the work her father's notebook pointed toward. And the mill was hers and it was standing and it had a working padlock, which was more than she'd had in January. She would figure out the rest. She heard a car on the track outside. Tires on gravel moving slowly. The sound of someone who was looking for an address and not certain they had the right road. She went to the window. A county vehicle, a white pickup with a magnetic seal on the door. It stopped in front of the mill and a man got out, 50s, in a canvas work coat, carrying a clipboard. He looked at the mill, looked at the truck, looked at the mill again. She went to the door and unlocked it and stepped out. He looked up. He had a broad, weathered face and the kind of squint that comes from years of looking at outdoor things in all weather. Voss property? He said. Yes, she said. I'm Clara Voss. I own this. He looked at her. Then at the mill. Then back at her with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. Tom Reardon, he said. County Assessor's Office. I had a work order come through this morning to do a reassessment on this parcel. He looked at his clipboard. Last assessment was 2011. We should have been out here sooner. Clara looked at the clipboard. Who filed the work order? He turned it to show her. The request had been filed online the previous afternoon through the county's public records portal. The name in the requester field was Miriam Voss. Clara kept her face still. Miriam had filed a reassessment request the afternoon of the estate reading. She thought about this for 2 seconds. A reassessment could go either direction. If the county found the structure was in better condition than the 2011 assessment indicated, the assessed value would go up, and the property taxes with it. If they found it had deteriorated further, the value would go down. Either way, Miriam having filed it told Clara something about what Miriam was thinking. She was not done with this property. She had walked out of the attorney's office saying $3 of value, and then gone home and filed a reassessment the same day. You're welcome to do the assessment, Clara said. I'll open the building for you. He nodded, made a note on his clipboard. He followed her inside and she stood to one side and let him work. He had a measuring device, a moisture reader, a structural checklist. He moved around the room methodically, noting things, running the moisture reader along the foundation walls and the floor. When he got to the workbench, he paused. "These tools," he said. "Mine," she said. He moved on. He went up the ladder to the second floor, and she heard him walking around overhead. He came back down. "What's the water source?" he said. "Creek runs alongside the east wall. My great-grandfather built the mill wheel off it. The wheel is still there." He made a note. He looked at the grinding stone. He put his hand on it the way people put their hands on old things, testing the reality of them. "This is in better condition than the file suggests," he said. "My father maintained it," she said. He wrote something on his clipboard for a long time. Then he said, "I'm going to have to reassess this upward. The structural condition is significantly better than 2011. The mechanism is intact. You've got historic value here, a working gristmill structure from 1911 in this condition. That's not nothing." Clara looked at the grinding stone. "No," she said. "It isn't." He gave her a copy of his preliminary notes before he left. The new assessed value wouldn't be official for 60 days while it went through the county process, but his preliminary figure was 12 times what the 2011 assessment had said. Still not market value, still not close to what Jean Pryor's report described, but 12 times a number is a different number, and it confirmed something she already knew. Nobody had looked at this closely. Not Miriam, not the county, not anyone. They had all looked at the outside, at the old wood and the dry wheel and the gray March air around it, and they had decided what it was before they went in. Her father had gone in. 37 years ago, in the worst year of his life, he had come out to this mill and gone inside and looked at things clearly and understood what he was standing among. He had documented it and protected it and said not yet to the people who wanted to take it quickly and cheaply. He had held it for her. The call from Miriam came the following morning. Clara was at the YMCA, sitting in the lobby while Nora used the pool for the public hour, when the number she recognized from the estate paperwork appeared on her screen. She looked at it for one full ring. She answered. Miriam's voice was the same as always, even, contained, pleasant in the way of a thermostat set to a specific temperature and holding it. She said she had heard that the county had sent someone out to the property, and she hoped everything was in order. Clara said it was. Miriam said she had been thinking, and that she wanted to raise something that might be of interest to Clara. She said it in the way people say things they have rehearsed, with a casualness that sits just slightly off from the real article. She said she had spoken with a developer, a man she knew through a friend, who had expressed interest in the Route 9 parcel. Not the mill specifically, she said, but the land and the creek access. She said she knew Clara was managing things on her own, and that a quick, clean sale of the parcel might free her up considerably. She said the developer had mentioned a number. The number was slightly above the old assessed value and considerably below what Jean Pryor had written in the second line of her summary page, and Clara understood immediately that Miriam did not know about Jean Pryor's report. Miriam did not know about any of it. She knew about the mill as it appeared from the road, a deteriorating agricultural structure on a half-acre parcel with creek access that a developer might want for something else. She had no reason to know anything more than that because she had not gone inside. And she had not gone inside because she had already decided the inside was nothing. She had been deciding things were nothing for a long time without checking. "That's a generous thought," Clara said. "I'm not planning to sell the parcel." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "I understand," she said. "I just wanted you to have the option. Things can be difficult when you're starting out on your own." Starting out on your own. Clara looked at the pool through the window, where Nora was doing slow laps with the patient persistence she brought to everything physical. Not a natural swimmer, but steady. "I appreciate the call," Clara said. "I'll be in touch if that changes." She ended the call. She sat in the lobby chair with the phone in her hand and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since February 14th. Not anger at Miriam. She had thought carefully about whether what she felt was anger, and she did not think it was. Not exactly. What she felt was clearer than anger. It was the simple recognition of how differently two people could look at the same thing. Miriam had stood at the entrance to the Voss mill and seen a liability. She had gone home and filed a reassessment and then called a developer contact, both in the first 24 hours, with the crisp efficiency of a person who had already classified the situation and was moving through the next steps. She had not gone in. Clara had gone in. She had gone in and sat on the floor and read her father's handwriting and opened a stone wall and found what was inside it. She had gone in and looked at each object in the morning, light and touched the sampler with the family names. The difference between those two experiences was not luck. It was the decision to look. She put the phone in her pocket and went to watch Nora swim. That afternoon she drove back to the mill and spent 3 hours there alone, going through the notebook systematically and making her own notes on the blank pages at the back. She listed every name her father had recorded, every contact and appraiser and inquiry, with their dates and the outcome of each interaction. She mapped the timeline of who had known about the collection and when. She counted the names of people who had expressed interest in buying and written next to each one the year and her father's response. No, not yet, told him it wasn't available. There were 9 such entries over 34 years. 9 separate contacts from dealers, collectors, and 1 institution. Her father had declined every one. Not because the offers were inadequate, she thought, though some of them were, but because he was waiting for the right time and the right person and the right circumstances, and the right circumstances had included her being old enough and present enough and capable enough to handle what he was leaving. He had timed it, as much as a person can time their own dying. She thought about that for a while, sitting in the mill with the late afternoon light coming through the windows and the notebook open in her lap. There was something in it that was both generous and hard. The knowledge that her father had held all of this for 37 years, partly for her sake and partly because he was the kind of man who, once he decided a thing was right, held to it with a patience that did not bend to easier options. She would not have had words for that quality when she was younger. She had words for it now. She was her father's daughter. She put the notebook down and went back behind the grinding stone and opened the panel and sat in the doorway of the hidden space. She looked at the objects she had rewrapped in their canvas covers and set back in their places. The carved figure, the bird, the painted panels, the box, the horse, the sampler, the 2 paintings. 9 objects that a scholar had been looking for 17 years. 9 objects that her great-grandfather or his father or someone in that chain of careful, making hands had created in the mid-19th century with no thought of what they might be worth in 170 years, no thought of anything except the work itself, the satisfaction of making something true, something that would last. She closed the panel and locked it. She put the second key back on the ring. She drove to the library and used the public computer to find Dale Marsh's faculty page at the State University. He was in the art history department. His published work included 3 papers she found through the library's database, 2 of which referenced the Voss family objects directly. In the most recent, published the previous year, there was a paragraph that she read twice. The Voss workshop objects remain the most compelling unresolved question in the study of regional decorative arts from this period. The documentation trail suggests a coherent body of work by at least 2 hands working within the same family tradition, the quality and integrity of which, if the objects survive in any reasonable condition, would represent a significant addition to our understanding of mid-19th century folk practice in this region. Their current location is unknown to this researcher. She sent Dale Marsh an email from the library computer. She gave him her name, her father's name, in 1 sentence. "I believe I have what you have been looking for." She gave him her phone number and told him she was available to speak at his convenience. She sent it and sat back and looked at the screen for a moment. She thought about her father writing "not yet" in the margin of his notebook. 34 years of not yet, of patience, of holding a thing that people wanted and saying it was not time. And then, at the end, leaving the key and the letter and the notebook in the folder, and saying it was time now, it was her time, she should go to the mill. She had gone. Jean Pryor called back at 2:15 in the afternoon the following day. Clara was in the library, at the computer, going through records of the 2019 comparable sales Pryor had cited in her report. She stepped outside into the gray March cold to take the call. Pryor's voice was unhurried and precise, the voice of someone who charged by the hour and spent every hour working. She said she had seen the voicemail and was glad to hear from Owen Voss's family. He was a careful man, she said. It was the first thing she said about him after acknowledging who Clara was. He was a careful, patient man. I've worked with a lot of families in estates like this and I don't encounter that often. The documentation he kept, the way the objects were stored, the fact that he turned down at least 3 significant offers over the years and held the collection intact. That kind of discipline is rare. Clara stood on the library steps in the cold and held her phone with both hands. What were the offers? She said. Pryor was quiet for a moment. I can't speak to all of them. I know the 2009 inquiry you'll have found in his notebook. There were others he mentioned to me when I visited. A dealer in New York in 2014, an institution in 2017. The 2017 was substantial. She paused. He said no to all of them. He said the collection was for his daughter, and that he wasn't going to let it go piecemeal. Clara looked at the parking lot in front of the library. The gray sky. The bare trees along the street. He said that specifically? She said. For his daughter? Every time, Pryor said. He was very clear about it. She had to look away from the parking lot for a moment. When she had her voice steady, she said, I want to talk about next steps. I have the full appraisal report in the notebook. I understand the basic picture. What I need to understand is the process. Pryor walked her through it. There were two primary paths. One was private sale, approaching specific collectors or institutions directly, which had the advantage of a targeted conversation and the potential for a premium on the coherent collection argument, but required time and relationships. The other was specialist auction, consigning to a house with a strong American folk art department, which had the advantage of competitive bidding and an established buyer pool, but meant a timeline, a consignment fee, and less control over the outcome. She said the market right now was favorable. She said a particular sale at a New York house the previous autumn had reset expectations for regional American folk art, and that there was currently meaningful demand from both private collectors and several institutions that had been building in this area. She said the timing from a market perspective was as good as it had been in 20 years. She said there was one other thing Clara should know. The 1997 article, Pryor said. The one about the Voss family workshop. It was written by a scholar named Dale Marsh at the State University's Art History Department. He has been looking for this collection for 17 years. He knows it exists. He does not know where. Your father communicated with him once briefly in 2006, and then declined further contact because he wasn't ready. Marsh has published 3 papers in the interim that reference the missing Voss objects. In the most recent one, from last year, he described them as the most significant undocumented body of regional folk art remaining in private hands. Clara was quiet. He's been looking for them, she said. For 17 years, Pryor said. And Clara, she continued, the institution that made the 2017 offer was the State University. Through Marsh's department. Your father turned that down as well. But that level of interest does not diminish. Given what Marsh has published in the years since, I would expect it has grown considerably. Clara processed this. The State University had offered to buy the collection 6 years ago and her father had said no, not yet, and put the notebook back in the hidden room and locked the panel. He had been waiting for her. She asked Pryor what she would recommend as a first step. Pryor said to talk to Marsh. Not to sell, not to make any commitment, but to establish the scholarly context and authentication. His involvement would add depth to the provenance record and potentially increase the collection's value to both private buyers and institutions. He would also be the most knowledgeable person alive about what she was holding. And Pryor added, he has been waiting a long time. He will want to come. Clara thought about the sampler with the family names, the carved figure with the initials W. H. and the date 1847, the 2 paintings in the oilcloth, wrapped and preserved for over 100 years, and then for 30 more years in a dry space behind a stone wall. Her name was on that sampler. Voss family. The thread was 170 years old and someone had made it with care, and with the intention that it would last and be known by the people who came after. She had come after. She pulled her coat tighter against the March cold. Can you send me Dale Marsh's contact information? She said. I'll email it today, Pryor said. And Clara. She said her name the way you say it when the sentence after it is the one that matters. Your father made good choices. The objects are in extraordinary condition. The provenance is clean and documented. You are in a strong position. Whatever you decide about how to proceed, you should know that. Clara thanked her and ended the call. She stood on the library steps for a while after. She did not go in right away. The cold was still present, but she did not feel it the way she had been feeling cold for the past 14 months. As a threat, as something to manage and defend against. She felt it now simply as weather, as the March air doing what March air does in this part of the state, working out what it intends to be. She thought about her father driving out to the mill on his good days. The drive down Route 9, the track through the pines, the particular sound of the door dragging across the stone threshold. She thought about him going behind the grinding stone and checking the panel, the lock, the dehumidifier he must have installed at some point because the space was dry in a way that a stone room near a creek wouldn't be on its own. She thought about him coming out and standing in the mill the way she had stood in it, with his hand on the grinding stone, in the building his grandfather had built, in the county his family had lived in for 150 years. He had said in the letter that the mill had been something he needed, a place where the decisions were his, where the quiet was his own. She had read that sentence and thought she understood it, and now, standing on a library step in March with Pryor's voice still in her ear and 9 objects waiting in a hidden room, she understood it more completely. He had needed the mill the way she was going to need it. Not to live in, not to hide in, but to return to, a fixed point, something that had been here longer than the difficulties and would be here after them. She went back inside and found Nora in the bird section with the Peterson guide open in her lap. Nora was cross-referencing the illustration against a sketch she had made in a small notebook of her own, a composition book she had been given by Mrs. Huang at the start of the year for science observations. The sketch was careful and specific. She had drawn the beak at a precise angle, the crest. She had labeled the parts. Clara sat beside her. "Honey," she said. Nora looked up. "We're going to be here for a while," Clara said. "In this town. Near the mill." Nora looked at her. The way she looked at facts, directly and without dramatics. "At the mill?" she said. "Near it," Clara said. "I'm going to figure out housing. But we're staying. This is where we're from." That last sentence surprised her when it came out. She had not planned it. But she heard it land, and it was true. Truer than she had let herself think about for a long time. This was where she was from. The county. The creek. The mill. The name Voss on a sampler stitched in 1851 by hands that were gone now but had made something that lasted. "Okay," Nora said. "Can I go to real school?" Clara looked at her daughter. 7 years old, cross-referencing a field guide against her own observations, building knowledge the way her father had built things, carefully, with both hands for keeps. "Yes," she said. "You're going to real school." Nora nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who has been waiting for a piece of information, and has now received it and filed it correctly. She looked back at the Peterson guide. She pointed to an illustration. "That one," she said. "I saw that at the mill. A pileated woodpecker. Mrs. Huang says they make holes in dead trees for other birds to use." Clara looked at the illustration. The large black and red bird, the strong beak, the work it was built for. "That's something," she said. "I know," Nora said. "It makes something for everyone else without knowing it." They sat together in the library with the bird guide open between them, and outside the gray day moved toward evening, and on Route 9 the Voss mill stood in the cold with its door locked and the padlock holding and the grinding stone still and the creek running alongside it. And in the space behind the stone wall 9 objects waited in the dark, patient and dry and intact, the way things wait when they have been carefully kept by someone who understood what they were worth and was not yet done keeping them. When they got back to the car that evening, Clara checked her email on her phone. She had 2. The first was from Jean Pryor, a brief professional note with Dale Marsh's faculty contact information, and a sentence that said she would be available if Clara had further questions. The second was from an address she didn't recognize at first, the State University domain, sent 47 minutes after she had sent her own email from the library computer. She opened it. 12 sentences. She could feel in the phrasing what it had cost him to keep it to 12 when clearly more wanted to come out, the restraint of a careful man who did not want to say too much before he understood the situation. He said he had received her email, and that he wanted her to know he had read it 3 times before responding. He said his research into the Voss family workshop had spanned 2 decades, and that he had often wondered whether the objects still existed, or whether they had been dispersed or lost without record. He said he understood that this was a family matter first and a scholarly question second, and that he had no wish to impose on either, only to offer whatever assistance or information he could provide if she found it useful. He said he could make himself available to travel on any schedule that suited her. The last sentence was the one she read twice. He said, whatever condition the objects are in, whatever circumstances brought them to you, the fact that they have survived and that someone kept them speaks for itself. Clara sat in the front seat with her phone in her hand, and the heater running low and Nora reading in the back seat. She thought about her father keeping the objects for 37 years. She thought about his grandfather building a hidden room into the foundation in 1911, tucking that practical dry space into the stone the way you tuck something important into a pocket, not making ceremony of it, just building it in because that was the right place for it. She thought about the chain of decisions across 100 years that had landed everything here, in this parking lot on this March evening. The fact that they have survived and that someone kept them speaks for itself. Her father had kept them. She took out the notebook and opened it to a blank page near the back. She wrote Dale Marsh's name and below it his email address. She drew a line connecting it to Jean Pryor's name above it, and another line connecting both of them to the number from Pryor's 2019 summary page. She wrote Tuesday and underlined it. She looked at the word mill written lower on the page from before. Then she looked at the Food Lion, at the ordinary lit windows of it, the parking lot that had been her address for 2 months, and she thought about all the ways a thing can look like nothing from the outside. She thought about Miriam. She thought about the county assessor's 2011 file. She thought about every person who had driven down Route 9 for 100 years, and seen the old gray building by the creek and kept driving. She thought about her father who had stopped. "Honey," she said. Nora looked up. "We're going to be all right." Nora looked at her for a moment, with the specific attention she gave to statements she was evaluating for accuracy. "I know, Mom," she said. "Not I hope so. Not okay." "I know," the same 2 words in the same tone her father had used when he wrote "you are going to be all right" on the 4th page of a letter, as a statement of fact, something he had decided was true and did not require hedging. Clara looked at her daughter and understood, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that the quality she had spent the last 7 years watching in Nora, that particular groundedness, that steadiness under difficulty, was not something Nora had invented on her own. It had come from somewhere. It was in the handwriting in the notebook. It was in the stone foundation of the mill. It was in the Voss family sampler stitched in 1851 by hands that had known winter and loss and the specific difficulty of building a life in this county on the labor of those hands alone, and had made something anyway, had made something careful and true and meant to last. She turned off the overhead light. Outside the Food Lion lot the county road went quiet, and 4 miles down Route 9 the mill stood in the dark beside the creek with its padlock holding, and in the space behind the stone wall 9 objects waited through one more night in the long chain of nights they had already waited through, not much longer now. Dale Marsh drove up the Route 9 track on a Tuesday morning in a car that was older than his position at the university suggested, a Subaru wagon with a cracked rear bumper, and a parking permit from 3 academic years still curling on the windshield. He got out and stood in front of the mill for a long moment before he did anything else. He was in his mid-50s, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly distracted posture of someone who spends most of his time reading and only partially remembers, when he steps outside, that the body requires participation. He looked at the mill the way she had looked at it that first day, taking in the water wheel, the stone foundation, the dark timber frame, the particular gravity of a building that had been here long enough to become part of the landscape rather than an addition to it. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him look. He turned when he heard her. He introduced himself and shook her hand with a directness that was neither performative nor awkward, the handshake of a person who has learned to be present without making ceremony of it. He said he appreciated her contacting him. He said it simply, without the elaborate gratitude that would have embarrassed both of them. She unlocked the mill and they went inside. She had spent the previous day preparing. Not staging, not arranging things for effect, but tidying the practical disorder of her own investigation, the stray notes, the empty water bottles from 2 days of sitting on the mill floor. She had rewrapped the objects in their canvas covers and returned them to the hidden room. She had set the folder and the notebook on the workbench where they could be easily reviewed. She had brought a portable LED lantern from the storage unit on Birch Street, which improved the light considerably over the cracked window alone. She showed Marsh the workbench first. The folder, the notebook, the Hartwell letter and the Pryor report. He read without touching the documents, standing at the bench with his hands in his coat pockets, which she understood was not indifference but training, the habit of a man who had spent his career handling things that damaged easily. When he had read both reports he looked up. Frederick Hartwell was a solid appraiser, he said. Old school. He undervalued things because he was cautious rather than ambitious. His number in 1989 was conservative even for that year. And Pryor? Clara said. Pryor is the best in this category in the country, he said. He said it plainly, without emphasis, the way you state something that is simply true. If her 2019 numbers are what she put in that report, and if the objects are in the condition she described, then what you have here is not a modest collection. He paused. May I see them? She took him behind the grinding stone and opened the panel. He stood in the opening of the hidden room and looked at the canvas-wrapped objects for a moment before he stepped inside. She watched his face. He was not a man whose face gave much away, but she saw something in it when he stepped through that doorway, something she recognized because she had felt it herself when she first unlocked the panel. The weight of standing in front of something you had been looking for. He crouched beside the first canvas package and looked at it without touching. He looked at the way it had been wrapped, the twine, the quality of the canvas, the dryness of the space. How long has this room been sealed? He said. Since 1987, she said. My father found them that year and closed them in here. He opened it to have them appraised twice but otherwise kept it locked. 37 years, Marsh said. In a dry foundation. He was quiet for a moment. That is an extraordinary set of conditions for preservation. He unwrapped the first object himself slowly with both hands, rolling back the canvas the way you peel back something that doesn't want to be rushed. The carved figure came out of the canvas and into the lantern light, and he set it on the floor of the main room and crouched in front of it. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything. He took a small flashlight from his coat pocket and ran it along the surface of the wood from different angles, looking at the tool marks, the paint, the way the grain had been worked. He turned it to look at the base with the initials and the date. W. H. He said quietly. He said it like a name he had been waiting to say out loud. You know who made it? Clara said. William Hertz, he said. He straightened up and looked at her. He worked for the Voss family for 11 years starting in 1841. He was a German immigrant, a trained carpenter and woodcarver. There are 3 pieces attributed to him in museum collections, 2 in the State Historical Society, and 1 at a folk art museum in Pennsylvania. He paused. I have never seen a 4th in person. He looked at the carved figure on the floor. Until now. They spent 3 hours in the mill. Marsh unwrapped every object and examined each one in the same careful way, methodical, unhurried, running his light over surfaces and turning things in his hands and occasionally making notes in a small spiral notebook he pulled from his shirt pocket. He did not perform enthusiasm. He was not the kind of man who performed anything, but his attention had a quality to it that told her everything she needed to know about what he was seeing. When he came to the oilcloth package, he set it on the workbench and unwrapped it with particular care, folding the oilcloth back in sections. The 2 paintings came out into the light oil on canvas, each roughly 16 by 20 inches, dark with age at the edges but the central areas clear and vivid. 2 farm scenes painted in the flat direct style she had noticed when she first looked at them, figures and animals, and a building that she recognized as a version of this mill, the mill as it had looked in the 1860s, the water wheel turning, a man standing at the door. Marsh looked at the painting of the mill for a long time. She asked him the painter's name. He told her. She did not recognize it, but she wrote it in the notebook carefully, the way her father had written every name he was given. He said there were 11 documented works by this painter. 7 were in institutional collections. 4 were in private hands, the last recorded sale of one having taken place in New York the previous autumn. She asked what it had sold for. He told her. She wrote that number down too. When everything had been examined and rewrapped and returned to the hidden room and the panel locked again, they stood in the main room of the mill and Clara asked him to tell her plainly what he thought the collection was worth. He considered the question. Not because he didn't have an answer but because he was the kind of man who gave honest answers, and honest answers require precision. Jean Pryor's 2019 valuation was accurate, and in some cases conservative, he said. The market has moved since then, meaningfully in this category. The William Hertz piece alone has comparables now that didn't exist when she wrote that report. And the 2 paintings. He stopped. The 2 paintings are the ones I need to think about. She waited. The last documented private sale of a painting by this artist was 14 months ago. He said. It sold at auction in New York for significantly more than Pryor's upper estimate for comparable works. Since that sale, there has been active institutional interest. 3 museums have contacted me in the past year asking about known works in private hands. I told them I knew of none. He looked at the panel in the wall. I was wrong. What do the museums want? She said. To acquire, he said. And to exhibit and study. There is scholarly significance here beyond the market value, the coherence of the collection, the documented Hertz attribution, the mill provenance. A reputable institution would factor all of that into a purchase offer. He paused. If you chose to sell privately to an institution, or to consign with a specialist auction house with these pieces highlighted correctly, I believe the outcome would be considerably above what Pryor projected. She asked him how considerably. He gave her a number. A range, low to high, the way careful people give numbers. He said the low end assumed a standard auction process without the additional scholarly context. He said the high end assumed the right buyer, correctly informed, understanding what they were acquiring. Clara held the number in her head, the way she had held the numbers her father had left in the folder. Not with excitement, not yet. With the steadiness that she was learning, the same steadiness that was in the handwriting and in the stone foundation, and in the Voss family sampler stitched in thread that had lasted 170 years. She asked him what he would want in terms of his own scholarly interest if she proceeded with the sale. He said the right to publish. Access to document the collection before it dispersed or transferred. Attribution credit for the research, not financial compensation. He said he had been working on a monograph about regional folk art in this county for 6 years, and that the collection, if documented properly, would be the centerpiece of it. She said she would think about it. He gave her his card, which she put in the notebook. He looked around the mill once more before he left, at the rafters and the grinding stone and the water wheel visible through the south window, gray and still in the March light. Your family built something here, he said. Not just the mill. He gestured, a small movement that encompassed the objects behind the wall, the whole accumulated body of it. They built something that lasted and kept adding to it. That's not common. He drove back down the track and Clara stood in the doorway of the mill until the Subaru was out of sight, and then she went inside and sat on the floor beside the grinding stone with the notebook open in her lap, and she let herself feel, for the first time without checking it, what it was she was sitting on. She called Jean Pryor that afternoon. Pryor listened to her account of Marcia's visit without interrupting. When Clara finished, Pryor was quiet for 3 seconds. The paintings, she said. Yes, Clara said. That auction in New York last autumn, Pryor said. I attended it. I watched that piece sell. She paused. I should have revised the upper estimate for your collection when I heard the result. I didn't because the estate was in flux and I didn't want to raise expectations without confirmation. She paused again. Consider them revised. They talked for 35 minutes. Pryor outlined the options with the same precision she had used before, but with updated figures that reflected both Marcia's visit and the current market. Private institutional sale, which would mean approaching museums directly with Marcia's documentation as the foundation of the offer. Specialist auction at one of 3 houses Pryor named, each of which had a strong American folk art department and an established collector base. Or a hybrid approach, private sale for some objects, auction for others, depending on which path served each piece best. She said the paintings should not go to auction without institutional interest already established. She said the Hertz carving should go to auction because competitive bidding would serve it best. She said the textiles and decorative objects could go either way. She said she would handle it if Clara wanted her to on a standard consignment arrangement, and that her commission rate for a collection of this significance was the same as for any other work, because the significance of the work was already in the price. Clara said she would let her know by the end of the week. She drove back to the Food Lion lot and sat in the car. Nora was in school. Clara had registered her the previous Thursday at the elementary school 4 blocks from the library, using the mill's address on Route 9 as their residence, which was technically accurate in that it was real property Clara owned, and the school registrar, a tired woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, had accepted it without question. Nora had walked into school on Monday morning in the purple fleece and the library card in her jacket pocket and her Peterson Field Guide in her backpack because she had decided it was also a school book, and she had not looked back at Clara when she went through the door. She had just gone in, the way she did most things. without making more of it than it was. Clara sat in the Food Lion lot with the notebook and thought about the number Marsh had given her. She thought about what it meant in practical terms. A rental deposit on an apartment. First and last month. A used winter coat for Nora that fit properly. School supplies that were not borrowed from the library's donation bin. A storage unit bill paid through the spring. The certified deed copy from Calvert Ames, $20, which she still had not retrieved because she had not had $20 to spare that week. She thought about what the high end of that number meant. It meant choices she had not had in 4 years. Not the restoration of the life she had before. That life was gone and she did not grieve it the way she once would have because she had learned in 14 months in a car what she actually needed and what she had only thought she needed. It meant something quieter than that. The ability to make a decision from a position of stability, rather than from the edge of the next crisis. The ability to think past the end of the month. She thought about what her father had known when he wrote the letter. He had known, in general terms if not specifically, what she would find in the mill. He had known the number range from Pryor's report. He had chosen to give this to her rather than sell it himself, in the years when he still could have, because he had decided that the right thing was for her to have it when she needed it. She wondered if he had known how much she would need it. She thought probably he had. He was a man who paid attention, even at a distance, even through years of careful silence. He had pressed the 220s into her hand on the porch and watched her face when she almost refused them and decided not to. He had understood, in that moment or before it, more than she had shown him. She picked up the phone and called Miriam. She had not planned to make this call. She had thought about it and set it aside twice, telling herself she would wait until the sale was further along, until she had more of the picture. But she was her father's daughter in this too. And her father had been a man who understood that some conversations, however uncomfortable, were better held directly and in full. Miriam answered on the second ring. Clara told her she had had the mill's contents assessed by an appraiser and a scholar. She told her the assessment had confirmed that the objects inside the hidden room were of significant value. She told her that she intended to proceed with the sale through proper channels, and that she wanted Miriam to know before the process moved further. She said it plainly, without emphasis, the way Miriam had said most things to her over the years. She gave her the information and let it land. Miriam was quiet for longer than Clara had expected. Then she said, "Your father never told me about any of this." "No," Clara said. "He didn't." Another silence. "He went out there often," Miriam said. "The last few years when he could still drive. I thought it was just the building. Sentiment." She paused. "I didn't ask him about it. He never offered." Clara looked at the Food Lion. "He was thorough," she said. She heard Miriam exhale. A slow, controlled exhale, the sound of a person absorbing something they had not seen coming and choosing, in their particular way, how to respond to it. "I see," Miriam said. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "I hope it goes well, Clara. The sale. I genuinely do." She said it the same way she had said she hoped the mill would be useful to Clara, at the attorney's office, with the even pleasantness of a woman giving something she considered adequate. But this time there was something underneath it, some quality Clara couldn't name precisely, that might have been recognition. She thanked Miriam and ended the call. She sat with the phone. She did not feel triumph. She had thought she might feel something adjacent to it, something vindicating, and she did not. What she felt was more like the quiet at the end of something, the particular absence of tension when a thing you have been braced against resolves without collision. She thought about the camel coat and the leather bag. She thought about the pleasant voice that had said $3 of value with the confidence of someone who had already calculated the situation. She thought about how Miriam had filed the reassessment the same afternoon as the estate reading, quick and purposeful, already moving to establish a number before Clara had a chance to. It had not been cruelty. She was clear about that. Miriam was not a cruel person. She was a person who organized the world according to what she could assess, and she had assessed the mill as nothing and acted accordingly. But she had not gone inside. That was the thing Clara kept returning to, not as a point of victory but as a fact worth understanding. The difference between what the mill had appeared to be, and what it was had been entirely a question of whether you went in and looked. The information had been there for 37 years. The objects had been there for longer than that. Nobody had been deceived. The county assessor had a file. The padlock had been on the door. Anyone who wanted to look could have looked. Her father had not hidden what he was doing from malice. He had hidden it from the particular knowledge that certain things are safer when they are held quietly, when they are not offered to people who have not yet earned the right understanding of them. He had known that Miriam would see the objects and see their price and make a calculation about what to do with them before she understood what they were. He had known this because he understood how she assessed things, the same even pleasantness he had lived beside for 20 years. Good at surfaces, less interested in what was underneath. He had kept what was underneath for Clara. She drove to Calvert Ames's office and paid the $20 for the certified deed copy. The woman at the desk, the same one who had told them it would be 15 minutes and taken 30, gave her the copy in a manila envelope without ceremony. Clara thanked her and walked back to the car, and sat for a moment with the envelope in her lap. Certified. Her name on the deed. Clara Elaine Voss, owner of record. The same language it had been in Calvert Ames's folder since February, but now in her hands, her copy, filed and documented and permanent. She put it in the notebook. The process took 8 weeks. Jean Pryor handled it with the same unhurried precision she brought to every conversation, moving through the options in the order she had outlined, working the institutional approach for the 2 paintings first while simultaneously preparing the Hertz carving and the decorated box for a specialist auction in Philadelphia in late May. Dale Marsh spent 2 full days at the mill in early April with a photographer and a conservator he brought from the university. He documented every object with the thoroughness of a man who had been waiting 17 years for the opportunity, and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. The conservator, a woman named Patricia who wore cotton gloves and spoke about the objects with a steady reverence that Clara found unexpectedly moving, confirmed that the storage conditions had been exceptional. She said she had seen pieces kept in climate-controlled museum environments for decades in worse condition than these. "Your father knew what he was doing," she said. Clara had heard this several times by now, from Pryor and from Marsh and from the Hartwell letter she had read again since the first day. She received it differently each time. It did not diminish with repetition. It accumulated. Patricia spent a long time with the sampler, photographing it from several angles and examining the thread work with a loupe she carried in her kit. She said the embroidery technique was consistent with regional needlework practices of the mid-19th century, and that the condition of the linen ground was remarkable for its age. She said whoever had made it had used high-quality thread, the kind that held dye, and that the colors, though faded as expected, were still distinguishable. She read the names aloud as she photographed them, the Voss names going back 4 generations, and she read them with the same even care she brought to everything, not with ceremony but not without awareness either. Marsh worked quietly alongside her, making notes, occasionally asking Patricia a question and receiving a precise answer. He had the manner of someone who had spent his career in the company of objects made by people who were no longer alive, and who had developed through that company a kind of patience that was different from ordinary patience. It was not the patience of waiting for something to happen. It was the patience of understanding that some things had already happened, and that your job was to receive them accurately. On the second day, near the end of the afternoon, he stood in the doorway of the hidden room and looked at the empty space where the objects had been. The canvas packing material Clara had folded neatly and set to one side. The wooden shelf her great-grandfather had built into the wall. He said, mostly to himself, 37 years in here. 40 before that, in my great-grandfather's time. Clara said from the main room. Before he built this room they were in the mill itself, I think. They would have been part of the household. Marsh looked at the shelf. Your family treated them as ordinary objects. That's why they survived. Nobody tried to preserve them. They were just kept the way you keep things you live with. He came out and they stood in the mill in the late afternoon light. Your father made good choices, he said, which was what Pryor had said and which she still received the same way each time. Not as a compliment about a dead man but as information about what had been done for her, specifically, over years she had not known about. Clara had heard this several times by now, from Pryor and from Marsh and from the Hartwell letter she had read again since the first day. She received it differently each time. It did not diminish with repetition. It accumulated. Dale Marsh's institutional contact at a museum in the Northeast responded to his preliminary report within a week. Clara knew the museum by name, Had heard it mentioned the way you hear major institutions mentioned as a category as a place where important things lived. The curator replied to Marcia's email with a formal expression of interest and a request for a viewing. She came to the mill on a Wednesday afternoon in April with a colleague, and the two of them stood in the hidden room and looked at the two paintings in the oilcloth and did not look at each other while they looked at the paintings, which Clara understood was its own form of communication. The curator made an offer the following Monday. It was above Pryor's revised upper estimate for the paintings. It included a provision for naming credit in the permanent collection label, Voss Family Collection, and a provision for a research partnership with Dale Marsh's ongoing scholarship on regional folk art. Clara accepted it. The Hertz carving sold at the Philadelphia auction in late May. She attended the sale in person. She drove down on a Thursday morning with Nora, who had been told about the auction the week before in the same straightforward way Clara told her most things, and who had said, without looking up from her field sketch, "So the carved man is getting a new home." Clara had said yes. Nora had said, "I hope it goes somewhere with good light." It was an old person's observation, the kind that required having spent time with old things and understood what they needed, and Clara had sat with it for a moment before she responded. The auction house was on a street in Philadelphia that smelled like old stone and exhaust, a converted building with high ceilings and a room full of wooden chairs and paddles. She and Nora sat in the back. Nora had brought the composition book and was sketching the room, the high windows, the auctioneer's podium, the way light moved across the ceiling. She was not interested in the auction as an event. She was interested in the room as a room. When the Hertz carving came up, it was presented on a stand under focused light. The auctioneer read the provenance notes that Marsh had prepared, which Clara had also read, and she heard her family's name in the description, Voss Family Collection, attributed to William Hertz, 1847, and she felt it land in a way she had not anticipated. Not her name. Her family's name. The whole of it, going back to the man who had commissioned this work and housed it in a mill he built on a creek in a county where his name had been for 100 years before he was born. The bidding opened. She watched the paddles. The hammer came down. She wrote the number in the notebook, next to William Hertz's name, and underlined it once. Then she looked at Nora, who had not watched the bidding at all but had drawn an accurate rendering of the carved figure from memory, and was adding crosshatching to the hat brim. "Good," Nora said without looking up. "Now it goes somewhere with good light." She had. The auction house had confirmed the buyer was an institution. A folk art museum in Virginia with strong natural lighting in its main gallery. Clara had asked Pryor to request that information. Pryor had said that was an unusual ask. Clara had said she knew. The remaining objects, the painted panels and the decorated box and the carved horse and the sampler, sold through a combination of Pryor's private placement and a second auction in the fall. The sampler she asked Pryor to handle with particular care. She had told her that it was a family piece and that she wanted it placed where it would be seen, where it would be understood as what it was, not stored in a study facility but exhibited. Pryor placed it with the Regional History Museum 40 miles from the county, in a permanent collection focused on local families. The curator there sent Clara a photograph of it on the wall, in a climate-controlled case with a label that read Voss Family Sampler, 1851, wool embroidery on linen, depicting the Voss family of this county over 3 generations. Clara put the photograph in the notebook. By October, 11 months after her father had died on February 14, the last object had been placed and the last payment had cleared. She sat at the kitchen table on the day the final transfer confirmed and she looked at the number in her bank account and she let herself sit with it for a full 10 minutes before she did anything else. Not counting. Not planning. Just sitting with the fact of it. The fact that 11 months ago she had been in a coat she hadn't taken off indoors since January, with 12% battery and a parking lot for an address, and that this morning she had an apartment with a yard and a daughter in school and a bank account that said she was not standing on someone else's patience anymore. She was standing on her own ground. Her father had left her that. Not the ground itself. The ability to find it. She thought about what it had taken to find it. Not the practical steps. Those were clear now in retrospect, the appraisers and the scholar and the auction house and the museum offer, the sequence that Pryor had navigated with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. That part had been straightforward once the information was in hand, once the objects were known and the contacts made and the process begun. What had taken something harder to name was the decision to go inside the mill in the first place. Not the physical act of unlocking the padlock and pushing the door open, that had been easy. The decision to treat it as something worth looking at closely when everyone around her had already decided what it was. Miriam had decided from the outside. The county assessor had decided from the 2011 file. The developer Miriam had mentioned had decided from the creek access and the half-acre and the assessed value. They had all looked at the same thing and seen nothing because they had already arrived at their conclusion before they looked. Her father had not done that. He had gone in. He had crouched on the floor and unwrapped canvas and looked at each thing with the full attention of a person who did not already know the answer. He had been in the worst year of his life and he had not let that make him hasty or reckless or desperate, had not grabbed the first offer or made the first call or let urgency make the decision for him. He had looked carefully and then he had held carefully for 37 years and handed it on. She had tried to do the same. She was still learning it. But she had gone inside when she could have driven away. That was the first thing. Her father had said so. She had rented an apartment in the county in April, the second week after the museum offer came in, a 2-bedroom on a street called Alderman Road with a yard in the back that had a crabapple tree the previous tenants had planted and not stayed to see mature. The landlord, a quiet man named Ed who owned 4 properties in the county and maintained all of them with the same steady attention her father had given to the mill, had asked her how long she intended to stay. She had said, "I expect a while." He had said, "Good. Long tenants are easier." She had driven back to the Food Lion that evening, the last evening they would sleep in the car, and sat in the lot for a while with the engine off. She had looked at Gerald's truck still in the manager's space, and then at the lot itself, the ordinary layout of it, the painted lines and the cart return and the lit windows of the store, and she had thought about what it meant to have been here and to be leaving. Not with sentiment, not exactly. With the specific recognition that a place where someone was kind to you is not nothing, even if the place was a parking lot and the kindness was looking the other way. She went inside and found Gerald in the produce section. She thanked him. She did not explain everything because everything was long and he was on shift and she had never been comfortable with the performance of gratitude, the kind that asks the other person to witness your relief. But she said enough. He nodded the way he nodded at things he had already made peace with. He said good luck and meant it and went back to the produce and she went back to the car. They moved their things from the storage unit on Birch Street the following Saturday. There was not much. 2 hours, 3 trips with boxes, and the apartment on Alderman Road held everything they owned with room to spare. Nora stood in the middle of her bare room and looked around and then went to the window and looked out at the crabapple tree in the backyard. "It's going to have apples," she said. "In September," Clara said. "I'll draw it," Nora said. Before and after. Nora had a room. She painted it herself, a pale yellow she had chosen from a sample book at the hardware store, standing in front of the display for 10 minutes without rushing and then pointing at the color with the certainty of someone who had done their research quietly and arrived at a conclusion that did not require discussion. She was enrolled at the elementary school. She had found a girl in her class named Priya who also kept a nature journal and who had never, before Nora, had someone to compare field sketches with, and the two of them spent recesses at a corner of the schoolyard they had designated for observation purposes, crouching near the fence to look at things in the grass. Nora came home from school most days with the composition book open to a new page. One evening in June she came home with a drawing of a bird Clara didn't recognize and said, "Priya's mother says the schoolyard used to be farmland and that's why there are still meadow birds at the fence." She listed 4 species and their characteristics. She had already written them in the composition book with their habitat notes. Clara had bought Nora a proper Peterson guide of her own, hardcover, with her name written inside the front cover in Clara's handwriting. Nora had added, below Clara's inscription, a small drawing of a pileated woodpecker. She had labeled it and dated it and below the date written, "First bird I identified at the mill." Clara kept the mill. She had thought about what to do with it in the months after the sale, now that the objects were gone and the hidden room was empty and the building was what it had always appeared to be from the road, an old agricultural structure with a dry wheel and a stone foundation. She had thought about selling the parcel. She had thought about what the developer Miriam had mentioned would do with the creek access, whether it would be built on or changed in ways that would take the creek's particular sound away from the place. She had decided to keep it. She had Pryor's conservator come back in September and give her a full structural assessment. The conservator brought a colleague who specialized in historic structures, and the two of them spent a day on the property and produced a report that outlined what the building needed to remain stable for another generation. Repointing in 2 sections of the foundation, new glazing putty in 3 windows, attention to the roof flashing above the north wall. None of it was beyond what the sale had made possible. She hired a local contractor named Bergstrom who had done historic preservation work in the county for 20 years, and knew how to work with old timber and old stone without imposing on either. He came out to Route 9 in October with a helper, and they worked for 3 days quietly, in the particular way of craftsmen who understand the building they are inside. On the last day she came out to the mill while they were finishing. Bergstrom was on a ladder at the north wall. He came down when he saw her and showed her what he had done, walking her around the foundation, pointing out the repointed sections, the new glazing, the roof flashing he had replaced. He showed her where the original mortar met his new work and explained how he had matched the mix so the repair would be invisible in 10 years. "Your great-grandfather did good work," he said. "This foundation is as solid as the day it was laid." He put his hand flat on the stone wall. She knew that gesture. She had made it herself and her father before her. She pressed her hand next to his on the stone. Cold and old and solid, the way foundations are when they have been built right and kept. She locked the mill when Bergstrom left, and she stood outside for a moment in the October afternoon. The water wheel was gray and still. The creek ran alongside the east wall with the sound that had been here since before the mill was built, stone-cold water over round stone, indifferent to everything the land around it had been through. The trees at the edge of the half-acre were turning, the sugar maples going amber and the oaks still holding their dark summer green a little longer, the way oaks do, as though they have decided not to be rushed by the calendar. She had brought Nora this afternoon. Nora was inside the mill, doing what she always did when she came out here, walking the room slowly and looking at things, occasionally making a note in the composition book. She had come to the mill 6 times since March. Each time she walked the same circuit, workbench to shelving to grinding stone, and each time she was quieter inside the mill than she was anywhere else. Clara did not know exactly what Nora was making of the place. She did not ask. Some things needed to be let alone to develop at their own pace. She heard Nora's footsteps on the mill floor, and then the door opened and Nora came out and stood beside her. They looked at the mill together from outside, the two of them in the October afternoon with the smell of turning leaves in the air. "Did you know," Nora said, "that pileated woodpeckers come back to the same trees?" Clara looked at the stand of white pine at the edge of the property. "I didn't know that," she said. "They make the same holes bigger every year," Nora said. "They go back and they keep working." She looked at the mill. Like whoever built this kept making it better. Clara thought about the foundation stones her great-grandfather had set in the creek bed and pulled up the bank. She thought about the generations of maintenance, the oiled locks and the replaced glazing and the hidden room built dry into the stone so that the things inside it would last. She thought about Bergstrom's repointing, the new mortar matched to the old, the work invisible in 10 years. "Like that," she said. Nora looked at the water wheel. "It should turn again sometime," she said. Clara looked at the wheel. Gray and warped, the paddles still attached, still there. She had not thought about the wheel as something that could move again. She had thought about it as a fixed part of what the mill was, a stop thing, a remnant. But Nora said it the way she said things she had thought about and decided, simply, without drama. "Maybe it should," Clara said. Nora went back inside. Clara stood at the mill door and looked at the creek for a moment longer, at the water moving over stone in the same way it had moved since before the mill was here, before the wheel was here, before any of this was here. The creek did not know it had powered the mill for 30 years. It did not know the mill had stopped. It just ran, doing what water does, which is to find the lowest way through and keep going. She pulled the door shut and locked the padlock. She looked at the mill the way Marsh had looked at it that first Tuesday morning, taking in the whole of it. The timber frame and the stone foundation and the north wall Bergstrom had repointed, and the windows with their new glazing, and the padlock she had changed in April when she changed her address. A new padlock for a new chapter. The same building it had always been. The same building everyone had driven past for 100 years without stopping. She thought about her father's letter. The last sentence on the 4th page, the handwriting uneven and effortful, written by a man who was doing what he could with the hands he had. "I am glad you came to the mill. That's the first thing." She had come. She had gone inside when everyone else had looked at the outside and decided. She had pressed her hand to the grinding stone and read 4 pages of careful handwriting and opened a stone wall with a key on a ring and sat on the floor with her daughter reading beside her and understood. Slowly and then all at once and then slowly again, what she was holding. She was still holding it. Not the objects, those were gone to their right places in museum cases with proper labels, in the hands of collectors who understood what they had. What she held now was something her father had wanted her to have, and that could not be appraised or auctioned or filed in a county recorder's office, though it was related to all of those things. She knew what she was worth. She knew what she came from. She knew the name stitched in thread in 1851 and the hands that made the carved figure in 1847 and the man who had built this room in 1911 with stone from this creek and timber from these trees, all of them Voss, all of them here, all of them part of the same long line of people who made things carefully with the intention that they would last. She was at the end of that line and she was also not the end. Nora was in the back seat of the car now, looking at the mill through the rear window with the composition book open in her lap, drawing something Clara couldn't see. She was building her own record of things, the same impulse in a new generation, the habit of paying attention and writing down what you notice so that the noticing would not be lost. Clara got in the car and drove back toward town in the October afternoon, through the county roads, past the Food Lion where the parking lot sat ordinary and lit as it always had, past the YMCA on Foster and the library on Main and the elementary school where the day was still in session, and she drove to the apartment on Alderman Road with the crabapple tree in the backyard. And she went inside and put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her. She had been adding to the notebook since March. Her handwriting was different from her father's, smaller and less deliberate, the hand of a person still learning to slow down to the pace of things that mattered. But it was in the same book. The same black cover, the same lined pages, the continuation of the same record that had started in 1987 in the worst year of a man's adult life, when he had come to his grandfather's mill looking for a fixed point and found instead something larger and quieter than he had expected. He had written it all down. He had kept writing for 37 years. She was in the 4th month of her own writing. The pages she had added were fewer than his and less certain in their handwriting, but they were in the same book, running directly after his last entry the way a sentence continues after a comma, not a stop but a pause, one person handing the thought to the next. She turned to a blank page near the back and she wrote the date at the top. Below it she wrote, "Mill is stable. Objects placed. Nora's well." She looked at the last sentence. Nora came in through the back door and dropped her backpack in the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator with the easy proprietary comfort of a child who knew her house. She poured herself a glass of water and sat across from Clara and opened the composition book to the page she had been working on at the mill. She had drawn the mill from outside, from the angle where the water wheel was visible and the stone foundation met the ground and the creek was a line at the right edge of the frame. She had drawn it with the same care she drew birds, the proportions considered, the texture of the old timber indicated with fine parallel lines, the wheel's warped paddles exactly as they were. At the bottom of the drawing she had written, "The Voss Mill, Route 9. Then below that, the way she dated and labeled all her observations. October. Then one more line. "We come from here." Clara looked at those 4 words for a long time. She looked at her daughter, who had opened the Peterson Guide and was turning pages with the unhurried focus of a person who is exactly where she intends to be. She looked at the mill drawing on the open composition book page. She looked at the notebook in front of her, her father's handwriting and her own, continuing each other on the same pages. "We come from here." She turned back to the blank page and below Nora as well she wrote one more line, in the same careful hand, meaning every word. "So am I." Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.